the program paper that you have, and my colleague Isabella will moderate the panel discussion. The event, of course, features the work of Štěpán Černoušek, the head of the virtual museum Gulag.Online and chairman of Gulag.cz Association. He'll talk much more extensively about the project. We're also joined by Stephen Barnes, who's associate professor of history at George Mason University and a former scholar here of the Kennan Institute. So I think I'll just introduce Ambassador Kmaniček then, ask him to come up, and then we'll go right into the film screening. Before his appointment and since 2013, Ambassador Kmaniček worked as director of the Foreign Affairs Department in the Office of the President of the Czech Republic. His diplomatic career has spanned more than 2 decades since he joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Czech Republic in 1995. He's been Director of North Africa and Middle East for the Ministry, Director General for Asia, Africa, and America, as well as Deputy Foreign Minister. He has also served as the ambassador of the Czech Republic to Australia, India, and the United Nations in New York. So he has not a small amount of diplomatic experience. And with that, Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Minister, Excellencies, Štěpán Černoušek, it's my pleasure to be here, and I will not be long because the worst thing which can happen to you is the long, boring speech of any ambassador. So I will try to keep it short because you are here for the very different purpose. Basically, I would like to mention just 3 points. Point number 1, why the Czechs, as the author and we at the embassy, are interested in Russian subjects. Why Czechs? Well, it's obvious because it's one of the main Czech questions. If you ask the Czech where he is from, he will proudly announce he's from the Central Europe. Most of the Americans will tell him that he is from the Eastern Europe, which opens the discussions where is the border between the Center and the Eastern Europe. And actually, the holder of the correct answer of that question, the answer to that question is the Russian President Putin. Because if, discussing the duality of the Russian soul, we take Russian Federation as the European state, then the Czechs are Central European. If we take Russian Federation as the last part of Asia, then the Czechs are the eastern border. So the basic Russian question, who is Russian, what makes Russian Russian, actually defines the identity of Czechs as well. So if this wouldn't be a reason enough why we are associated with the projects like today's one, where we would like to thank the Kennan Institute and the Wilson Center. There is the second point why we are interested in that. I'm sure sooner or later somebody will mention here Santayana and his famous saying that you have to go through your own history if you don't remember it. History is about remembering, and we live in a little bit Orwellian world where, like, we are in the present, the future is more or less certain, but the past is what is constantly changed with the interpretations, disinterpretations, misinterpretations, and reinterpretations. And all of that is the game of history, and we know that we remember close to 10% of what we read, but close to 50% of is what we know is our visual memory. So that's why we are very keen on the projects of the new history, which becomes a little bit more visual than the traditional approach, hence the project of the 3D and the Gulag history. The third point, because I promised to be very short, the Czech approach to that is vital for us because it defines who we are, as I tried to explain. We have our own complicated, long history, which means that we are into the modern projection of the history because it defines who we are based on the interpretation and reinterpretation of our own history. And the Czech approach to it is usually through the joke. The Czech usually use the sense of humor as the first and usually the last line of defense as well. So I will end up untraditionally with a Czech joke about the Gulag system. And that time joke went like that. Ivan Ivanich ends up in Gulag, and the other inmates ask him, "How many years you got?" And he says, 20. And they say, "For what?" And he says, "For nothing." And they tell him, "You're lying. For nothing, you would get 10. You got 20. And as in each Czech joke, it's more like a Zen Buddhist story which encapsulates all the absurdity of the history which we are going to see today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador, for that joke. It was a perfect lead-in, obviously, into our event. I'm Isabella Tobarovsky with the Kennan Institute. Before we begin, I'm going to say that I'm not going to introduce our guests. We have a sheet where their bios are given. If you don't have it, please raise your hand. We have somebody here who can hold your hands up. And there's some folks here in the front. So thank you, Gemily. I'll tell you very quickly about how we're going to run this event. So we're going to start with Štěpán talking about his project for a few minutes, for however much time he needs, and then we're going to show the film of his and his team's journey up the Yenisei River to visit the remains of one of the gulags there. After that, we will come back and Steve Barnes will give us some additional remarks to put what we saw in additional context, and then we'll have a discussion, question and answer session. So this is approximately the run of the show today. So with that, without further ado, Štěpán, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, and thank you once again, Wilson Center, for the invitation. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for your introduction. And thank you also for very good questions. Why Czechs? And I would add another one, why in the United States, about the Gulag and the Russian history. I don't know. And it's very unexpected for me. A few years ago, I would never say that my trips to Siberia, which started as like my hobby and just I was curious about the Siberian nature, that the end and the result will be trip to the United States and a lecture in the center of Washington, D.C. But it's now, it's here, it's nice. I'm really, it's my pleasure to be here. And why I am here, I'm at the Fulbright Scholarship now in the United States, invited by the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience. Our Gulag.cz Association is a member of this coalition, and my goal here in the United States is to visit different American museums and sites and organizations who which somehow deal with sensitive chapters of history, and to learn it, to share my experience with their experience about how to deal with the history, about the new technologies in museums, because we work a lot with 3D and virtual reality. And until now, I was in California in, for example, in Manzanar, former concentration camp for American Japanese during World War II, in Angel Island, in Alcatraz in San Francisco, and also in Louisiana and South Carolina in former like plantation museums. So now I'm full of a lot of experience. I would say that I'm over-experienced sometimes, and but and it's really interesting to be here and to also to see how Americans. How important for them is to speak about the history, to have many views from many sides on many historical moments. So sometimes it's hard for me to focus back on the gulags and Russia this period. But today I will do it. Is anybody here who doesn't know what the Gulag was? Everybody knows. But in San Diego, there were people who didn't know what the Gulag was. And even in today's Russia, there are like young people who don't know what the Gulag was. So, in my opinion, this is the very important moment to speak more about the topic, about the Gulags, because it doesn't concern only Russian history or Russian or Soviet citizens or Soviet nations. And it's another answer of the Mr. Ambassador's question, why Czechs and why in the US? Because the Gulag and Soviet repressions concerned also many other nations from all over the world. There were repressed, or the victims of Soviet repressions were 20,000 Czechs or Czechoslovak citizens. There were a lot of people from Poland, from France, from Netherlands, from other European countries, and also a lot of Americans. Do you know about this story, about the history of Americans in the gulags? Yeah, thousands of Americans in the beginning of 30s, during the Big Depression, decided to, when they lost their work, for example, in Ford companies, the workers decided to move from the United States and to come to Soviet Union to help them to construct a paradise on a world for workers. There were many baseball teams in Moscow at that time, but in the end of 1930s, most of them were or executed or sent to the gulags. And it's almost a forgotten chapter of history. But I think it's one of the moment why it's necessary to speak more about it, because as I said, the topic is international, not only Russian. And when I started to travel to Russia some 25 years ago, I like to travel to very remote parts, to Siberia, because Czech Republic is very small. It's too populated. There's no real wild nature, but we Czechs, we like to go to nature, to sleep in tents, and to find some adventure. We like to read about Wild West and so on. And my Wild West, I found my Wild West in Russia, in Siberia, which is full of really wild nature and nice people. And I started to go to these remote parts, and very often these like cities or towns in Siberia somewhere were built by Gulag prisoners. And I started to be curious about this history, how they deal with that, what they think about that, and I found that it's very confused today. For example, one city of Turkhansk in the middle of Siberia, there's a small museum. In one room is an exhibition about the gulags and the repressions. And in the second room is an exhibition which glorify Yakov Sverdlov, a communist or Bolshevik, one of the leaders, and who was sent there during Tsar regime. And it's really confused to celebrate one of the person who was responsible of the gulags in one museum which is dedicated also to the victims of the gulags. So that's a problem about today's Russia, how to deal with this story. And I was curious more and more about these places, and I started to focus more on that, to look for more information, and I started to read more about abandoned, like about places where are some footprints of gulags, and I found that there is no one museum which would be built on a place of former Gulag camp. However, there were 30,000 individual labor camps during Soviet era, and no one of them is moved into a museum. There's one exception, Perm 36, but it's another story. The museum was really great, but it was the founders were expelled by local authorities, and today the exhibition about the Soviet dissidents were removed and replaced by exhibition about brave work of guards. So I can't call it like as a real museum of the Gulag. So once there is no museum of the Gulag on a place of former camps, but still there are these places, abandoned camps, I decided to go there to visit it and to map it and document and to put it on the internet to make it reachable, at least virtually, for broader public, because almost nobody knows how those sites looked like. And I can't imagine that there would be like former German Nazi camps abandoned somewhere in the European forests and not removed, not museums from them. So that's briefly my story of the project of Gulag.cz and Gulag.Online, and the movie, which is really new. I finished the movie just during the first month of my scholarship here in the US in February. So the movie is about one of our expeditions in 2013, but only now we found as foundings for finishing the movie. So you can, I will stop my speaking. Just look, watch the movie, and then we will.
What an extraordinary film. So, Stepan, why don't you make a few more remarks, right? And then we'll move to Steve and continue the conversation.
The movie was filmed during our third expedition in 2013. Before that, there were two expeditions in 2009 and 2011 to the same place, like the abandoned camps along the former construction of the railroad between cities Salihard and Igarka. And then 2016 there was a fourth expedition of our team to eastern Siberia, to Kodar Mountains, where was mined uranium for the first Soviet atomic bombs. And during the last expedition we documented 4 another camps. And in general we mapped around 20 abandoned camps, which is very few, but anyway, it's at least something.
So, do you want to tell us? Did we agree that you're going to tell us now about what came out of it with
We can, or maybe later, because
Later, okay. Okay, why don't we do it later? And I want to say that the virtual reality demonstration, it's actually a really extraordinary thing, but it requires personal, individual viewing. So at the very end, those who want to experience it can stick around and come up to Stepan and we'll do it. Okay, Steve.
Wow. So I spend most of my time in a history department at George Mason University here in Northern Virginia, where I'm surrounded by American historians who have to brave the wilds of College Park, Maryland to do their research. And when I'm with such people, usually I'm the one that gets to tell the good stories about what it's like to have, over the last 20 years, worked in Russia and in Kazakhstan on the history of the Gulag. And yet I sit here watching this film and thinking about what you've done and say, holy cow, I'm not worthy. The amount of effort, the true danger that went into the work that you've done is truly amazing. So let me first off thank the Kennan Institute, thank the Wilson Center for the opportunity to be here to view this film. Thank you to Isabella for arranging this. Thank you to the Czech Embassy. Actually, they have long been interested in this history. I spoke there, I think it's been almost 10 years ago now, at an exhibit of paintings by Nikolai Getman, a former Gulag prisoner who did a whole series of paintings on his experience in the Gulag. I think it's important for us to understand and to think about the fact that this is not just a Russian story. It's not just a Czech story. It's a human story. Histories like this should make us uncomfortable. I hope they make us uncomfortable. I often struggle, I think, with my own students when I'm teaching them about the history of the Soviet Union, the history of the Gulag, the history of Soviet repression. I struggle to make sure that they understand that this is not something that we just look at as something that happened over there and that happened back then. But that we look at these kinds of histories, we think about these histories, and we let them trouble us in the present, in our own moment, as we struggle through our own issues. This is phenomenal work, and it speaks to lots of questions in today's world. This combination of this amazing historical and archaeological research into the material remnants of the history of the Gulag are married with, and I hope you really spend some significant time on their web project, on their virtual museum, married to the latest in digital technologies to try to overcome some of the inherent difficulties in sharing the history of a place that was so often geographically marginal. So I'm going to try to provide just a little bit of context, both in terms of Gulag history itself, but also in terms of post-Soviet efforts to preserve the memory and to expand knowledge about the history of the Gulag, and where this project fits in that respect. So the Gulag, we should know, was a massive institution that over the course of the Stalin era, from the late 1920s into the early 1950s, we have something on the order of 18 to 20 million people passing through prisons, camps, colonies, various institutions of forced labor in the Soviet Union. This is not to count the peoples who were sent into exile, entire ethnic groups, social classes, people of this sort. The Gulag was all over the Soviet Union. It was in urban locations, and it was in the geographic and climatic extremes of the Soviet Union. So I want to talk for a couple of minutes about the decision of this virtual museum project to focus on what's called here the Dead Road or the Dead Railway, what sometimes you'll see referred to in English as the Railway to Nowhere. This is, of course, a well-known story. Images of the abandoned rail lines and these abandoned locomotives have come to represent for us, I think in many respects, the economic idiocy of the Gulag. This certainly goes back at least to the phenomenal work of the Polish photographer Tomasz Kizny, who documented some of these sites, must be 15 or 20 years ago now. And for the virtual museum of the Gulag, for this project, this choice is thus symbolically important. And I think it says to us something really important about Gulag history, because it's a representative of the economic irrationality of the Soviet use of forced labor. Forced labor deformed the Soviet economy. Some of the best work of economic historians over the past 25 years have demonstratively shown that the Gulag was on the whole an economic drain on the Soviet state. Oleg Klevnyuk, the Russian historian, described what he called the narcotic of forced labor. How the illusion that forced labor was somehow free or that it was even cheap, which of course is not at all the case, convinced the leadership to underestimate the costs associated with projects and to therefore engage in projects that were of questionable value for the costs that went into them. And these economic decisions had and continue to have serious, long-reaching economic and social consequences. Fiona Hill and Clifford Gaddy have shown how enormously economically costly some of these decisions are that were made under the illusion of forced labor being cheap, and the way that this continues to cost Russia today. It's the only country in the world that has sizable cities in the extreme northern latitudes of places like Vorkuta and Norilsk, places that were built on the backs of forced labor. So the economic idiocy of the dead railway and the role of the dictator as its irrational champion could not probably be more succinctly captured than in the fact that it's almost entirely abandoned almost immediately after Stalin dies. This abandonment itself then provides a second major reason that this is a perfect site, I would argue, for the virtual Gulag Museum project. Most Gulag sites were either repurposed or they were razed in the post-Stalin era. Some sites were converted to other uses. Some continue to serve the post-Soviet penal system today in much altered forms often, but a lot of the same locations. The penal geographer and sociologist Judy Palo at Oxford has shown us that in many ways the real memorial to the Gulag system is today's Russian penal system, as it continues to operate in a lot of the same places. But a project here that was abandoned so quickly after the end of the Stalin era in a location that was so remote that nobody cared to even recover abandoned locomotive engines provides in some ways the best possible conditions for a time capsule of the Stalinist Gulag. In a country that otherwise abandoned or covered up this history in the post-Stalin era. So of course here we come to the question of Gulag memory and of the role that it plays, or maybe in some cases we might want to say the role that it does not play in the post-Soviet world. The combination of the geographic marginality of Gulag ruins with the effective erasure of most Gulag locations that were closer to significant population centers means that a privileging of authentic spaces, of actually studying the spaces where the Gulag existed, of trying to remember those places, of trying to recover authentic Gulag artifacts, that all of this can unintentionally recreate the very marginality of much of the Gulag itself when it comes to the memory of the Gulag today. So these sites of the dead railroad still exist, at least for the moment. But as we see in the film, getting to them is quite difficult, and apparently you never know if they'll actually exist even when you arrive. Civil society activists, historians, and in some cases even governments in post-Soviet countries have tried to preserve at least something of what remains of the Gulag. Expeditions have been carried out over the years by organizations like Memorial, by the founders of the Gulag Museum at Perm 36, who, as Stepan pointed out, have been hostilely ousted from leadership of that museum, people that I've worked with also in the past. I've actually written about this whole episode for a book that will be coming out, one hopes, soon. Other people have gone and sought to bring back artifacts from long-abandoned Gulag sites and located in places like the Kolyma region, places that you can sometimes only reach by helicopter, by expeditions like what they carried out here. But these mere remnants of a place cannot fully stand in for the real locations. In Kazakhstan, where I've done extensive research on the history of the Gulag, they've attempted to reclaim authentic Gulag locations as sites of memory. So you can find, for example, in Kazakhstan, 2 major Gulag museums. One in the former headquarters of the enormous Karlog Gulag labor camp, that camp is the primary subject of my first book. The other in a purpose-built museum located on the site of the famed Akhmalis camp for wives of traitors to the motherland, which is the subject of the book I'm writing right now. But in choosing to privilege authentic space, to go to the space where the Gulag actually existed, they've decidedly left Gulag memory in the margins of civil society, of public discussion. I did extensive research in these museums, and I have to say it was a rare sight to see an actual visitor. It was mostly me and the employees of the museum, because they're very hard to get to. A place like the Dead Railway is unsuitable in this way as a place of memory that would have any real impact in post-Soviet Russia. Even if the current political regime were inclined to take such memory as serious and important. The place, as we see, is only accessible to the most intrepid of travelers, people far more intrepid than I. And so the virtual museum of the Gulag, this project seeks to take advantage of the geographic nowhere of cyberspace, of the internet, to bring this place of memory to a wider audience. They are, of course, far from the first to make such efforts. Whether we think about the virtual Gulag Museum created by the St. Petersburg branch of Memorial, the web presence of the International Memorial Society itself, the websites of numerous post-Soviet Gulag museums in non-Russian parts of the former Soviet Union, or even my own web project, gulaghistory.org. You can still check it out. It's over 10 years old now. It's not nearly as technically interesting as what's being done here. But many of us have tried to bring this history to life for wider audiences. This project is certainly, though, the most sophisticated technologically and one of the most engaging that I have seen. And I spent a good bit of time in it, though one of the challenges, I think, of 3D renderings of the Gulag is my computer is not that new, and it had a little bit of difficulty working the site. And this is, of course, one of the factors that could potentially limit its reach. As is the fact with virtual reality that it's going to be a matter of people coming up individually. And so while there are things gained with certain technologies, other things are perhaps lost. So I wonder if Stepan, if you could talk a little bit more about a number of sort of aspects of where this idea for the project came from, some of your thinking about it. I have a series of questions in mind that I'm thinking about, and maybe it will spur some discussion. So how do you address the challenges of how to represent this space in a 3D format? Challenges like whether to provide a representation of what's there, what you find today, or trying to recreate what it might have looked like in the Stalin era itself. How do you balance making it look like it did when it was in operation with recording what you actually find today? How do you deal with things like, well, you know, as I was looking through the 3D site, I noticed the buildings are almighty level. Everything looks very well built in the 3D universe, and one suspects that's not actually what it looked like at the time. And so how do you address these kinds of challenges? How do you face the questions opened up by the emptiness of the virtual versions of the camps? And I was actually interested seeing, so I did get a chance to preview the virtual reality, which I hadn't seen before. And there are prisoners in the barracks, which I didn't find, at least in the parts of the 3D online version that I looked at. So how do you, and this is, I think, a question that historical sites and museums have to answer today, right? Because if you're trying to give people a feel of a place, but yet you're giving them a feel of a place that's empty of the people who made the place what it was, right? A big part of the barracks experience was the crowdedness of it. It was the smells, it was the cold, it was all of these kinds of things that the visual can't fully represent for you. So how can you address these kinds of challenges? What does it mean if we can see barracks and barbed wire and bunks and watchtowers, but we have to imagine people? What is the difference between taking 3D renderings of a site and going on an expedition looking to bring artifacts back to a material museum? What is this bringing us new in this kind of respect? Does it raise troubling questions at all to think about a virtual museum of atrocity? And to think about the fact that I couldn't help but sometimes, as I was sitting there with it on my computer screen, I couldn't help but think that it had the look and the feel of a video game. It was all too easy, in fact, to imagine the virtual museum as the setting of a first-person shooter game that you see the young kids play these days. And this is troubling, right? Because it is both real but not quite real. What does it mean to create a virtual reality of such a place? What are the ethics of things like this? Have you engaged in conversation, and I gather that you have, because we were talking a little bit beforehand, with other museums that are facing the challenges of how to share the history of violations of human rights, histories of atrocity, in these kinds of formats, and the questions and the difficulties that raises. I think the work leaves us uncomfortable, but maybe that's a good thing, because I think this history should leave us uncomfortable. I always worry that we wind up too comfortable, that we wind up with this notion of, oh, this could never happen to us, it could never happen here. And so maybe the discomfort that one feels looking at this is a productive discomfort. So I ask all of these questions, by the way, not to be critical, not at all. I'm amazed by this project, but to be provocative, to help us to think through what it means, to see how you think about the work that you're doing. Questions that I'm sure you've spent a lot more time thinking about than I have. This is just my reactions to a little bit of time spent on the exhibit, looking at the exhibit. The work is brilliant. The research is amazing. The moral underpinning of what's happening here is absolutely critical. And I couldn't applaud more what I've seen and what I anxiously await continuing to see. So thank you.
Thank you, Steve. So, Stepan, do you want to address some of the things that Steve has raised? And then I have my own questions. I'm sure that the audience has lots of questions. So.
Yeah, to answer all questions, to all Steve's questions, we would spend here many hours. And thank you for that questions, and thank you for saying them loudly for everybody, because that's exactly something what I have been thinking about all the time from the very beginning, not from the very beginning, from the beginning of the project of the virtual museum. And it has been a process. Like the first were just expeditions. I was just curious. Then I decided to come back to document it in more detailed way. Then I decided to try to work with the 3D models. The virtual reality is something very new, which we haven't published yet nowhere. And I have here like a demonstration of virtual reality, which Steve has. He could have a look on that before this lecture. And if anybody of you is interested, you can have a look as well. Maybe can you screen the clip called VR and AR? It's just a very short 20 seconds clip which can show you how the virtual and augmented reality can be used in the topic like this. Actually, I bought the special headset just here in the United States because it's much cheaper here than in the Czech Republic, and I bought it from my money. Our whole problem is that we are like very small NGO. We are not supported by government or by any museum or organization or institution, and we got some grants to go to the last expeditions. The first expeditions were paid by our money, And that's the biggest problem. I would like to deal with all these questions, but it would be necessary to cooperate with many experts and not only IT specialists, but even people, historians and social scientists, etc. And it's a challenge, and it's something what we would like to develop more deeply. But at this moment, we don't have enough space, time, people, money to develop it very detailed. But I hope one day we will do it. I really hope to do it. And as you mentioned, there's a lot of questions. What is okay, what is not okay, how to use the virtual reality, how not to use it. It looks like a computer game, and of course, the process of gamification, it's something what happens in some museums, but is it okay to do it with this topic? Is it okay to choose to be a guard or a prison? I'm not sure about that, but I'm not sure where is the line, how to use it, what is okay and what is not okay. Maybe I'm very deeply in that, but it's a topic of discussion and of discussion with many people from many sides, and also how to show these places in virtual reality or in augmented reality. It's also a question. There's a lot of possibilities, and people from computer gaming society, they can do whatever you want if you have money to pay for that. So there's a lot of ways where to go, and I hope to choose the best one in future, which would be okay for everybody. But there's a lot of possibilities to do. And the most important why I think it's good to work with that is that I can show it to you here, like 3D or the some items or objects. You can move with that. You can have a look from all sides. You can feel like you are inside the museum. You are inside the barrack. Because I can move the abandoned camps to the United States, and you can't go there to a museum. But I think it's important for people who are interested in a topic to visit these sites, because you can visit sites, former concentration camps in Manzanar here in the US, in Auschwitz in Europe. So why don't to visit the former Gulag camp? And virtual reality is one of the ways how to do it. But we can spend more time discussing it. Thank you.
So I want to ask a question. I have a question for Steve and for Štěpán. Steve, you in your talk, you talked about obviously how these places are abandoned, but I think there is always a paradox when you talk about the Gulag. Actually, some kind of a paradox. So one of these is that when I've been to Norilsk, it's been many years since I've been there, but I met. And it's of course very different from what we saw here. It's a city. There is, it's an industrial town, and but it was originally a camp. And so we met some survivors there, who did not actually leave it at the end of their sentences. One of them was quite proud of what he had accomplished while he was in the camp. It allowed him. He learned a trade there. He became basically an engineer. He built up that whole big plant, and he didn't go anywhere. He stayed. He was proud of it. I think that part of the reason he didn't go is that he actually didn't know where to go back to and who to go back to, because after 20 years, where do you really go? But I wonder if you have encountered that as well in your research and what you think about it.
Sure. So I've spent a lot of time in Karaganda in Kazakhstan, which was itself a city that was built in many respects on the history of the Gulag. And as you talk to people there, and you start going into people's family histories, was one person put it to me, if you scratch a little bit, you always find the Gulag somewhere underneath these family stories. But it had come to be the place that they called home, in this case usually over the course of generations. But there are a number of reasons that this happened historically, and one of them is this issue of where did you have to go after you got out. And this had a couple of sort of particular consequences here. So a lot of prisoners, when they were released, were refused permission to live anywhere within 100 kilometers of the largest cities in the Soviet Union or the borders of the Soviet Union. For many people, this meant that their home was not a place that they could go back to. And without the possibility of going back to home, for a lot of them, the most comfortable thing was to stay where they were and to do the work that they had gotten used to doing. They were also often offered pay incentives to stay and to work in those locations. So Alan Barenberg has written a terrific book on Vorkuta, and especially on this transition from what he calls from Gulag town to company town. And it's really, really a fascinating story. You also have this cultural phenomenon in the Soviet Union of people living at the 101st kilometer. So you live as close as you could to your former city, but you can't quite go home again. But of course, even for those who could go home, many times the life that they had left behind was gone. Their families had been killed. Their families had abandoned them. Their spouses had moved on, had presumed that they were dead. So you can, if you read Vasily Grossman's Everything Flows or Forever Flowing, depending on the translation, it tells one of these stories of a Gulag prisoner coming back and finding that his life just doesn't make sense to him anymore. So we have these kinds of phenomena as well. But the notion that former prisoners were proud of the work that they've done, I think shouldn't actually surprise us. A lot of the work that they did, they at least saw as a crucial component of either the Soviet economy, of the effort in the Second World War, making a contribution in some way. For some of them, they were in fact learning some skills that they didn't have before. There was a lot of propaganda effort put into making their work seem to them important. Even if we know now that there's almost no question that this did economic harm to the Soviet Union as a whole, it doesn't mean that there wasn't this sense of pride for some and on some of the work and some of the projects that they were part of. And so here I think I would just make the point that we understand that the Gulag was a lot of different experiences. It wasn't the same in every location. People weren't always in for the same amount of time. They weren't always in the extreme remote locations. And so there are just lots and lots of different experiences that make up the history of the Gulag. And so what we read in One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich is one day in the life of one prisoner. And yes, in the life of lots of prisoners, but there are lots of other stories as well.
Thank you. And Stepan, I have sort of another aspect of the paradox of this history that I want to ask you about, this history and memory. Because on the one hand, we see there is a forgetting that's happening, right, in Russia. Like you said, a lot of young Russians may not even know that this was the case. We just saw these recent results of the opinion polls about Stalin being the most, highly appreciated and very, the most important figure that Russians think of in their history. And on the other hand, Yuri Dud, a very well-known Russian journalist, has just made a film about Magadan, which was a site of exile and labor camps, Gulag camps. And I think within 48 hours, 5 million people had watched it.
10 million.
10 million people. Okay, so there is a forgetting, and yet there is a remembering of some kind and a desire, almost I would say, to know more. And so I was curious if you have any thoughts about that, and also on your journey, whenever you encountered people who learned about your journey, like the monks, maybe there were others, what was their attitude toward your expedition? What did they think about that?
Yeah, the memory about the history in Russia is confused, as I said, and during our trips to Siberia, we spoke with a lot of local people. Many of them helped us, and we informed local authorities about where we are going and so on. And they was like, okay, because they know for sure that there are these abandoned camps and remains of the railroad, and for them it's normal. It's somewhere there in taiga okay, another strange tourists who are interested in those places. We don't understand them because it's history. Let it be in the forest, and that's the most common view on that. But they were okay. They were not against us, and they didn't force us not to go there. Of course, there are people who understand to our interest, like from the local museums in small cities in those areas, which are really nice people who exactly know about the importance of this topic, about the remembrance, but they don't have enough sources to organize their own expeditions who would document it well, those places. And they have just a lot of items from these camps which local people just brought from the abandoned camps, so it's shown in the museums. There are also like people, local fishers and hunters who regularly visit those abandoned camps, which are like far from the civilization, but sometimes some hunters visit it. But for them it's shelter. For them it's something what they can use for building a new, to construct a new shelter. They use like these letters or documents to make a fire or whatever. They don't know about the historical value of those items. So it's not possible to say there is one view of local people on that places. And the other question was about the Yuri Duch movie, which is really interesting, really new. It was published just a week ago, I think, and my Russian friends call it as a new Alexander Solzhenitsyn archipelago Gulag, because he's a 30-year-old YouTuber. Very influencing person, and he just decided to make this 2 hours documentary movie about the Kolyma region, about the Gulag Soviet repressions, about the memory, and he doesn't say anything new. And he visited this Kolyma region, and he doesn't show anything very special, no abandoned camps, but he's very important and influencing among young generation. And however, there's a lot of independent organizations, as Memorial or other historians. Stephen mentioned them. They have been done a lot of work last 30 years documenting these repressions and so on, but they never had so response as Yuri Duch has now because of his movie. And that's the important moment. That's why my friends from Russia call it as a new Alexander Solzhenitsyn, because they remember 1990 when the Archipelago Gulag was first published officially in Russia, in Soviet Union, and everybody read it everywhere, and everybody spoke only about it. And today is the same with the documentary called Homeland of Our Fear, I think, Rodina našeho stracha.
Right.
And it's everybody speaks only about this movie on Facebook, on Instagram, and that's very important that it just suddenly erupted, and it's the topic is again in the middle of a discussion. So.
Yeah, exactly. And this is a journalist who normally interviews popular cultural figures. So this was a new topic for him. And I think that the power of his film, which is, by the way, I think is also the power of yours, is that it brings to life the conditions under which all of that happened. You can actually feel that weather. You can see the snow in September. Yuri Duch went to Kolyma in the middle of the winter, so it's minus 50. So you can see he makes you feel what it was like there, being in that weather, and you have to ask yourself, what would it have been like to be there as a prisoner? So let's have questions from the audience. I'm going to ask you to say your name, wait for the mic, say your name, and be brief in your question, please. Okay, so right over there, please. Mm-hmm.
Hi, my name is Michael Gelb. I work at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and in my former incarnation, I was a Soviet historian. And I'm wondering if you could address my question in terms of like 4 possibly authoritative institutions. The question is, what are the greatest challenges to memory? Is it resistance and opposition to the history, or is it just sheer indifference? And I'm thinking of the Putin administration, the political parties, the church, and the educational system. If that's too much, just answer a little bit.
Thank you. Who would like to start?
I'm not sure I understood completely the question, but is it about like the authorities' view or control of the history?
No, I-
Authorities are resisting and just hoping this will all be forgotten, or are they just indifferent?
I think
What
authorities
is the biggest challenge to memory? Why do we not remember?
I think there is some kind of fight or battle between Russian authorities and independent historians and organizations about this history of Soviet terror, about the control of that history, how to explain that history. Even today's Russian regime don't say that there were no repressions and no gulags. Of course, there's a great Gulag museum, state Gulag museum in Moscow, which is not bad, but not so big. But anyway, it's a good institution, and there is a new memorial dedicated to victims of Soviet repressions, which was opened last year in Moscow, and Vladimir Putin opened the memorial. But during his speech, he didn't mention the name of Stalin. He didn't mention the word Soviet Union, and that's the problem. Like people from Memorial Society say that the problem is that official view on that history is that these repressions were something like nature disaster. There were million victims of these bad political repressions, but then it disappeared, and everything other was okay. Stalin was a great manager, and Soviet history is full of great victories, which we have to celebrate. So the official view is to soften somehow the history. Viktor Shmirov from Perm 36 call it as Gulag soft, Gulag light. Mm-hmm. So that's the problem. And the independent historians they ask who was responsible of those repressions, and that's in brief like my answer. Sorry.
Just, I mean, I certainly was thinking exactly what you were saying about Memorial. Arseny Roginsky, the late director of Memorial, would always say that it's portrayed today as a history with victims but no perpetrators. But I would say actually indifference is part of the story too, and I wouldn't miss that. So, I've slogged through issue after issue after issue of newspapers, and, trying to learn anything I could about the history of the camps in Kazakhstan. And it's really interesting. So there's this phenomenal burst of interest and activity in publications about the Gulag that hits about 1987. But it stops long before we get to the Putin years, right? I mean, it's 1992, 1993. Suddenly, the frequency of such articles drops off tremendously. And then you'll see articles periodically on sort of, days of remembrance of political repression or something like this. And so I think, I used to always talk about a phenomenon of Gulag fatigue that developed. I just don't want to hear the same story over and over and over again. And I do think that's a part of it.
Okay, we have, let's go to Mindy right there. Yeah.
Thank you. This was riveting. By the way, I worked in Kazakhstan. I never heard anybody talk about gulags. This is a revelation to me in that country. I know about it elsewhere. In terms of the documentary, be very helpful to us if you would include as an adjunct or some attachment, however the word is, with some of the personal letters you've retrieved. That was fascinating. What did they say? If you could also talk about, and maybe our historian could say something about the logistics of these encampments. Where did the food come from? Was it grown there? What about the clothes? People had to lead their lives. It was quite awful, but people did survive. And what was the management of these places? Were there religious services? It would help if you could flesh out kind of the social context. I know that you're not a professional historian, but maybe get the help of some people so that your viewers come away with an even richer appreciation.
Thank you for the idea to the second part of the movie. We would be happy to show it more, and yeah, for the diary we found there, it probably belonged to an engineer, but we don't know his name. We just found it in a camp hospital somewhere very hidden. And it's hard to find more information about the person. So at least we scanned and did photos of all the pages, and it's online accessible at this moment. And it would be great to find more information, but it's I can't imagine how to do it, because it's very hard to go to archives in Russia, and many of archival documents are or secret or destroyed. So I don't know how to learn more about it.
Did you want?
Well, I mean, this bigger question of context, of course, is huge, and there are entire books, including my own, on these kinds of subjects. But when I sort of mentioned this notion of the illusion that forced labor was free or cheap, this is a big part of the story, right? Because you have to somehow get food to these kinds of locations, and clothing to these kinds of locations, and guards to these kinds of locations, and administrators to these kinds of locations. And you have to circulate top secret documents to and from these kinds of locations with all kinds of rules about how exactly such documents are circulated. And I mean, all of this proves to be very, very, very expensive, and very difficult. And it's a huge part of the story, and why, in fact, there would have been far better ways to go about this kind of thing.
Okay, right here, please.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. Promise us no more white subtitles on white backgrounds, okay? I think it's really important to note that this is still going on in North Korea and Western China, and it would make a very powerful addition for the last frame of each of these films to say that, to point that out. I take spy satellite pictures and look at the prison camps in North Korea, and even Google Flyby is pretty useful in that regard. And I just hope you live long enough to document the empty camps in Western China and in North Korea as well. Can we ask what your next iterations are, or your next projects?
I would like to organize another expedition for sure. There's a lot of places in Russia where it would be possible to do it. Kolyma region, there's a lot of abandoned still remains or abandoned camps, or to Kazakhstan. There are the places in Kazakhstan are not so in the remote areas, but still there are like former barracks which are used like as stocks, for example, today, and it's something what could be documented more detailed. It depends on many other conditions where we will go next time. But what I would like to focus on is also some kind of exhibition which would use both like physical objects and documents, and also virtual and augmented reality, which would show to broader public this topic. And I think if we use those new technologies, it would be more interested for young generation, and it's something which I can imagine to be in our country, in the Czech Republic, in Russia, or in the United States. So that's something what I would like to develop, to spread this information to broader public.
Okay, Any more questions? Okay, right here.
You mentioned your trip to the United States and what we're beginning to do, at least even in terms of slavery, the Whitney plantation, which looks at it from the slave's perspective. I'm wondering whether you've thought of doing something like looking at what the Tsar did, because that was the beginning of those things, whether there's any, even if it's augmented reality or if there are records or something, and also the beginning. I mean, it was in 1930. It was in 1918, Trotsky had a plan to imprison Czech people, and also Stalin, for sure, before 1929 or whatever, or 1930, was already heavily involved in these Gulag types. And I'm wondering, physical evidence and augmented reality to look at before 1929.
It's the question how to use these technologies, what to show in this augmented reality and virtual reality. You can show something like which is real in a other place, and you can show it now here, for example, in many thousand kilometers from that place. That's how I think it's possible to use it. And of course, if we use it maybe one day on the exhibition, it's necessary to have a broader context to these technologies, about the history, about the history of the Gulag, what was before, what was after, and so on. So yeah, the context is very important.
Okay, and let's take those two questions together right there.
Were any ethnicities or nationalities in the former Soviet Union sent to the camps at a higher rate than others? And also, what did they do with all the German prisoners they captured? Did they stay in POW camps, or were they dispersed out to the Gulag?
Okay, and right there.
Yes, I'm Dr. Sam Hancock of Emerald Planet TV, and my question's to Steve. Looking at the high cost to the Soviet system, have you done any parallels to, Nazism and the extreme costs to their whole regime by the concentration camps and extermination of the Jews, because that was hugely expensive on them, and the amount of manpower that went into guarding, feeding, and all that. And then to my colleague up here on the right, what's going on with the Uyghurs in Western China and the drain that's going to bring on the Chinese economy, which may already be showing. And there's parallels, and this is going on today. And then how is this actually impoverishing North Korea and what they're doing? So we have parallels right here in 2019 today of this, and I just wonder if you could extrapolate across those four examples, and there's many others, but at least these were the largest and most pronounced. Thank you for being here. Very interesting.
Thank you.
So maybe I can address these questions. So on German POWs, I would actually just say that on Friday morning, I'm going to Carnegie Mellon University for a dissertation defense. There's a PhD student there who is just finishing her dissertation on the history of German POWs in camps in the Soviet Union. So I know a whole lot more about this, and we all will know a whole lot more about this than what we just recently did. The POW camps were often in the same locations that Gulag camps had been. Sometimes they repurposed Gulag camps for German POWs. Sometimes they were purpose-built institutions simply for German POWs. But we have obviously a substantial population of German POWs who continue to be held in the Soviet Union all the way into the early 1950s. And they contribute quite significantly, actually, to post-war reconstruction. She's done some interesting work with GIS technologies and mapping the locations of POW camps and shown the ways in which this integrates with aspects of reconstruction in this post-war Soviet economy. But you also will still hear, and it's certainly something that I heard through the years, in various places, oh, well, this building over here was built by the Germans, or this one was built by the Japanese, which interestingly also was usually a code for this is a higher quality building than most of the others. So it's a fascinating and interesting story, and I look forward to her continuing to work on this and turn it into a book project where we're really going to know a tremendous amount about that. In terms of some nationalities being imprisoned at higher rates than others, absolutely the case. Yes. I don't sort of have the facts and figures off the top of my head. They did record prisoners by what the Soviet state called nationality, we might think of as ethnic group. There's definitely overrepresentation of, and of course it differs at different points through this history, but of people like Chechens, of Jews, of Ukrainians. But anyway, the simple answer is yes, there are differences. I have looked into this in the past, but I don't have all of it at the tip of my fingers at the moment. In terms of the kinds of economic issues and economic comparisons, one thing that I would just sort of add here is that mostly what I was drawing on there was the work of others. So Paul Gregory, who is an economist at the Hoover, and he's been at the University of Houston. I'm not sure exactly where he's located at the moment, but he's worked with a whole group of historians, and you can find actually online their book, The Economics of Forced Labor in the Soviet Union. And so they've looked into these kinds of things, but there is this broader scholarship on free and unfree labor, and especially the extent to which unfree labor is typically not as productive as what we might have thought it had been. The comparisons are all over the place, and they're typically economically negatives overall for economies. I would just throw in, right, we live ourselves in a highly incarceratory society. Right? We have a tremendous number of people in prison in this country, and that has impacts here as well. So we shouldn't just comfort ourselves with the idea that this is just China and just North Korea and just somewhere else. We have to at least think about it. And I'm not telling you what you should think about this issue of our incarceration of so many people in this country, but I'm telling you it's an issue that we have to ask ourselves questions about. Anyway, sorry.
Thank you. So I just want to ask you the last question, and then I think we'll move on to those who want to see the virtual and augmented reality presentation. Please come up here, and Štěpán will do it. But I want to ask you, I'm very curious. It looks like the Gulag is now it's your cross to bear. It's the issue that you're passionate about. You're going to continue doing it. It's not going to leave you. I think a lot of us understand that feeling with whatever we're passionate about. What about your friends that you went to on this expedition? Did they say never again pronounce the word of Russia, the word Russia to me, or what were their reactions? What is their future in this regard?
We are not in regular touch with them. Like all of them has his specific life. But if when we are in touch, the first question is, when will be the next expedition? Wow. Because anyway, it was hard during the expedition. It was like very unsuccessful from the very beginning, and I just had a feeling that something is against us, that like the nature or taiga told us, guys, don't force too much, be more relaxed, have more respect. And if you have more respect, I will open the gate for you. And it was something very intensive for everybody of us. And it was a great adventure at the same time. All these, our expeditions were great adventures. So I would like to go with them one day to another place. And it would be nice, but they are not involved in our projects. They are not paid by our organization. We don't have sources for that. One of them is the student of geodesy. He finished his studies and he lived in Hong Kong today because he has a girlfriend there. The other one is the owner of a graphic designer studio in a small town close to Prague in the Czech Republic. And the third one is a manager of famous Czech climber Adam Ondrab, who is the best in the world, and he helps him to be even better, but they also use virtual reality for that reason. So that's something which is we discussed together. So it's
So fascinating, and yet it sounds like they would jump on another opportunity also to do it. So let's thank our speakers. Thank you so much.